Hi, I'm Dani Castellano, and this is Diet Culture, the podcast where sometimes I interview amazing people and professionals in the field of healing relationships with food, and sometimes I chat with my brother and fellow human who also hates diet culture, Nick. We talk about diet culture, a systemic and oppressive force in all of our lives that wastes our time at best and destroys livelihood at worst. We dissect the problems, share stories, and give suggestions on where we can all go from here. This podcast is for informational, educational, and inspirational purposes only, and never a substitution for individual medical or nutritional advice. Nick is with me today, and I'm pretty much talking at him for this episode because I'm sharing the intersection of my personal journey of being pregnant with diet culture and some things that I probably should have realized were going on before, but really came to light during this journey that I've been on. A lot of the issues with the educational materials, some things I ran into with advice from my doctor when my glucose tolerance test came back elevated, and how talking about bodies is still talking about bodies even when they're pregnant and in a different stage. So I hope that you enjoy this episode. This will be the last episode for season 1 while I go on my maternity leave, and I really look forward to coming back in the spring to keep on having these conversations. Hey Nick.
Hey Dan, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Post Thanksgiving, visited Richmond, got some bags from my favorite coffee roaster, and so I'm doing good.
Is that what you're drinking right now?
Yeah. I'm a big fan of Blanchard's coffee out of Richmond, if anybody is
Okay.
familiar.
I made some decaf black vanilla tea, and that is what I'm sipping on right now, and it is delightful.
That sounds awesome too.
All right, so for the last installment of season 1, I want to talk a little bit about how my pregnancy has shown how much diet culture infiltrates this population, and something that I had really no true awareness about. I probably could have guessed some of the things, but until you have like a lived experience or have someone talk to you about that extensively, it's hard to really know. And so part of this is me wanting to just share some experience about it for like validation, but also to provide some insight from being an eating disorder dietitian and some of the things that have occurred and how I have handled them, and in hopes that that could be helpful to other pregnant women or anyone who's supporting a pregnant woman. I think it's really important to say a couple things before we dive in. One, I do not specialize in infant, maternal, fertility, nutrition. I kind of did at one point when I worked at WIC, but not something I follow up too much on anymore just because of my specialty being eating disorders. And it's important to acknowledge that I'm experiencing my pregnancy from a place of thin privilege and also being generally a healthy individual, um, and also wanting to have this baby at this time in my life, and extend a lot of love and compassion to anyone who's lost a child or is unable to get pregnant who wants to. I think this is a hard space for a lot of reasons, and so I'm coming at it, like I said, from my experience, but also because I don't want to center myself. There's some other reasons that I want to talk about this too. So when I found out that, we were pregnant. We went to the bookstore that same day, because I wanted to start, like, learning, and we picked up the What to Expect When You're Expecting. Is that what it's called? I need
A
to fact check
classic.
myself because it's like I think there's a ton of versions of this, and it's like, most people would probably recognize this book.
I thought that was a movie.
Yeah, it is, but this is a text. Yes, What to
Okay.
Expect When You're Expecting. Um, and I dug into it a little bit, um, and was pretty quickly repulsed by the very, like, thin body-centered advice and language, and I just a lot of diet culture and fat phobia things were really popping out at me, and I actually ended up putting the book away because I find it really hard to trust resources when they're full of diet culture messages, which makes it really hard to get any information. But myself being a dietitian and having worked at WIC, I felt generally comfortable with, like, the nutrition related pieces, and I think that's a big piece of just from, like, social media and just hearing, people talk is a big concern, in pregnancy of, like, what to eat, and I think a lot of that is really ramped up because of our culture around having to, like, do this perfect thing, and that wasn't something I was really looking for. It was really the rest of the information that I wanted, outside of that, because that's not generally something I'm seeking, and, um, it just was really upsetting. I don't know why I was surprised, but just, like, thinking how many, people who aren't thin and white wouldn't be able to relate to a lot of what is in that text, and again, I can only speculate, but it did not seem very inclusive at all, and that was just very frustrating. I downloaded a couple of apps as well to track, like, what week I was in, how big baby is, those kinds of things, and there's so much, diet culture talk in there. So there's some basic, like, recommendations that based on your BMI, which is so frustrating, there's an amount of weight that someone should gain. So, basically, it's if you're at a quote unquote "normal weight" based on BMI, you're supposed to gain X amount. I'm not gonna go into those numbers, I don't think that's the point of this. If you are quote unquote "overweight or obese," you're only supposed to gain a set amount, and then if you're pregnant with twins, you're supposed to gain X amount, and those are kind of the guidelines, and as we know, from listening to this podcast, BMI is not something that I support or think has any use whatsoever, and so it really sucks that that's still something that's being utilized as like, the number of times I have seen that information and just, like, breezed past it because I'm like, "Oh my god, or you've gotta be kidding me, like, why are we still talking about this?" It just seems very, like I felt like I was entering something where like, sure, there are specialists, like, in-person conversations are probably a little bit different, but where every piece of information that you can find is pretty much telling you that this is what needs to happen, and it's so much like it's so diety, it's so fat phobic, it's so inappropriate, to, like, say that there's this set, very tight range for every single person who could conceive and what their body is supposed to do and respond with, in order to have, the best outcomes. It seems just so naive and very, like, outdated, based on where we're at, with understanding, but again, like, that's still go to the doctor and you're classified by BMI still and told to lose weight. So, again, don't know why I'm surprised, but it just has been very frustrating, um, because I think if I was not in a place of being, like, so far removed from caring about that kind of thing, like, just how much more worried I would have been about the number on the scale the whole entire time, and just all these other, like, nitpicky things that it's also written so, like, patronizing. When people try to, make I think I've written articles like this before, so I may be guilty of this, but, like, try to make something, like, cutesy and, like, funny while they're providing information, but it doesn't feel relatable, like, whatsoever. That's how a lot of this stuff is written, and so it's even extra frustrating because I'm just like, "Don't talk to me like this."
Gotcha. Gotcha.
Um,
Like a BuzzFeed
but a couple
article.
of the when I was yeah, a couple of the things I was, uh, finding when I was going back through the app, in preparation for this episode, a couple direct quotes I'll give you. Um Uh, One is to make sure it's, like basically it tells you, like, what you should be doing kind of at this time, and it doesn't always talk about nutrition in every week, but I'd say every several weeks. So, practice portion control. You're eating for 2, but don't go overboard. And, like, that's the kind of language it's like, that is literally the most useless piece of information and, like, statement. Like, you might as well just say nothing because you're telling like 3 different things at once that don't have any, like, further insight. So the rest of the sentence go or the next sentence goes on to say, "Eat about 2,200 calories," which set me off because, again, not every pregnant woman needs the exact same amount of energy. There are so many wildly different, reasons why people's energy needs would vary, and I think, like, the advice of increasing your intake by a couple hundred calories at different points in your pregnancy is way more useful because if you're eating enough food to begin with, that's like, "Okay, let me bump this up a little bit." But to just give this, like, arbitrary amount of calories that this was somewhere in, like, I think this was around 17 or 18 weeks that this advice was given, and so, like, if you're active and growing a child and already may have needed this much to begin with, like, that's, mm, concerning that that's the number that was written in this article, but you're supposed to eat that from mostly lean protein produce, whole grains, and heart healthy fats. And again, most people may like get the gist of what that means, but it's so vague and it really like to me that says it reinforces the whole like there's quote unquote good foods and bad foods that we're supposed to consume and like you need to be counting calories and don't go overboard even though you're eating for 2, and to say that you're eating for 2 isn't even useful because, like, the energy needs of, like, your growing baby versus yourself, like, it's not like you're actually for 2 like, it doesn't even make sense, and but it's always coupled with, "But don't do too much." So don't say that, like, if you don't actually want someone to eat for 2 people, don't say that. But that's just the kind of crap that was just so rampant, and every diagram, of the pregnant, body is very thin. Most of the advice given is talking about a pregnancy experience from a smaller body to begin with. Any talk about, um, someone carrying a pregnancy in a larger body, is typically, like, just a brief, like, sentence about how it's different, and then nothing useful is given. The pronatal course that I took for my continuing education for my certified personal trainer certificate, there was a nutrition piece in there. That was super frustrating. I don't think I watched it actually because I didn't need to know what they were gonna say. But there was a part where they were talking about this, thing that can happen called diastases recti, which basically is like your muscles are pulled, and if you're a personal trainer, like, sorry, in your abdomen, that was probably probably understood, but there's a way you can kind of, like, feel around for it to see if it's, like, deep and wide enough that you would have to refer someone to go to see a physical therapist rather than, like, treating them as if they could just strengthen and get back as a personal trainer, and there's, like, these guidelines for it. But they were talking about how anyone in a larger body that may carry more belly fat, you won't be able to assess this. And then that was, like, it. There was no, like basically, it was saying that this whole course was written for people in smaller bodies, and that's the only people that we're gonna spend time to care about and know how to take care of them. And it just like, is a call to do better because that's completely inappropriate. I wrote a review at the end of that course just about how this was completely tailored to smaller bodies, and that's not helpful. And if you don't have an answer, it's like the same kinda crap of, like, getting told to lose weight instead of having proper medical treatment, because that someone in a smaller body may be offered, and it's just absolutely infuriating and unacceptable that this is, like, what's going on in the world of, pregnancy. So, basically, it just, like, fueled my fire for absolutely detesting diet culture and wanting to spread the word even further about how unhelpful this kind of stuff is, um, and healthcare professionals need to do better, really. Um, okay, so when I had my well, first, do you have anything to say on this, Nick? I feel like I'm gonna talk at you most of this episode, but
Yeah, it's totally fine. So the
so far.
answer of what to expect when you're expecting is just diet culture. Just clarifying.
Yeah,
Okay,
basically.
cool.
Yeah. Um, so when I had my, glucose tolerance test, so around when was that? Sometime around, like, 24 weeks or so, I believe, is when I had that done. You have to drink, this container of straight, like, sugar water. It's just glucose, and it's a certain amount, and then you wait an hour and get your blood work drawn to see where your glucose is. So when I am not an expert on this matter, but when you are pregnant, your placenta um, is exuding hormones that cause insulin to work a little bit differently in your body is the gist of what I've come to understand about this. So that's why it's really important to test this during pregnancy because there's things going on in your body other than just like a baby growing in there that can affect your health and baby's health. And so my results came back and um I was one number below like within normal limits. So my general understanding of labs, just from what I have to look at them for, as a dietitian, is that if something is within normal limits, that like it's okay. Um, and so I was like, great, I passed. And I got this message like a day or so later from my doctor in my chart, um, saying that I passed but barely. That's directly what was said, and that I should read up on diabetic diet, try following it for a month, and then we'll retest." And I, like, absolutely lost my shit when I read that because, well, 1, it was upsetting because I had initially looked at my results, and nobody wants to have nobody wants diabetes of any form. No one wants something that, like, wants information that something in their body isn't working right, like, that's alarming. So, like, first of all, I was confused about why we were concerned, and I did some looking, and I'm not going to call it research because I was just, like, reading up on this on some websites that I trust, but, um, that some doctors consider, like, within 10 points below the, like, normal to want to, like, test further because they're worried they might not catch it. So I'm like, "Okay, like, maybe that's where my physician or my OB is coming from." And so I mostly felt angry because I was thinking about, well, 1, um, how I have a history of an eating disorder, and I cannot remember for sure if that was on the form that I filled out of, like, my previous health, because it likely has been on forms, but I don't get talked to about that, like, that doesn't seem to be anything that anyone ever wants to engage in conversation with me around, when I say that I had an eating disorder, and just thinking about how I was asked to research a diet when that is something that I'm so protective of myself over, because even though I've said this before, like, even though I've been in recovery and, like, I don't, like, subscribe to the messages that I once did, I think if you've ever had an eating disorder, you have to be protective of yourself to avoid the things that could create that storm to relapse. Um, and there's a lot of varying opinions about, like, what recovery means, but I do think even if that voice in your head is so quiet that and you're, like, actually moved on and removed from it, that you rarely ever think about the fact that you had an eating disorder, which is where I would consider myself. I think that that is just such poor healthcare to encourage that and not know if that could be something that was very triggering for an individual, um, and so that was my one thing of, like, thinking about all the people who I know that are working so hard towards recovery and just, like, how difficult the world is to navigate, and that you can't just trust healthcare providers that don't specialize in that kind of thing. I don't even know if there are OBs that specialize in eating disorders because like, I have no idea. I've never looked. I don't know if that's a thing. I'm sure some are up on it more than others because you can certainly get pregnant while you have an eating disorder, so I'm sure that that is addressed at times, but just that thought of, like, feeling so angry for someone offering advice like that without knowing who they were offering it to. And the other, like, self-righteous part of me was like, "I'm a fucking registered dietitian. How dare you tell me to research diabetic diet?" Because I'm I'm not a diabetic expert, but, like, I understand how to eat to help regulate blood sugar, and, like, my diet being trash isn't likely the reason that I have elevated blood sugar, just understanding, like, what happens with gestational diabetes in the first place, and, like, beyond that piece being very frustrating, um, I was very sick during my first trimester. I was nauseous, I was vomiting, I was gagging constantly for the first 3 to 4 months, and I pretty much could only consume, like, cheesy carbohydrates if I was able to eat anything, um, and I had to eventually ask for medication to help with my nausea because I was concerned, like, I was not eating enough food, and to then be told later in my pregnancy to go on a diet, I understand that, like, diet is a term that's, like, talking about what your regular pattern of, intake is. However, when you Google, uh, which is what I was told to do, diabetic diet, there's a lot of talk about eating really low calorie, about it being about weight, about just, like, avoiding certain foods entirely, which is not advice that is even appropriate to just be like, "Don't eat this." Um, and so it just really sucked because I felt if this was something that I needed to do to be well for myself and for my baby, it would have been really nice to be educated with something that was actually useful because in school, in my internship, I attended a diabetic, um, class, and they had a section for gestational diabetes of, like, helping, pregnant women learn how to eat to manage their blood sugar, and it's helpful, but, like, for just the average person, Googling diabetic diet is not gonna produce appropriate, like, useful advice, which is why, like, I always felt so frustrated when I and still do when I worked outpatient, and even the things that my, patients with eating disorders tell me that they, like, learned online, I'm like, "Oh my god, like, this is not useful." And having access to a dietitian, especially like, okay, you're told to follow a diabetic diet for a month to have your blood sugar retested. If I have the ability to access a dietitian, um, when am I gonna be able to get an appointment? And then usually the first appointment with an outpatient dietitian is a consult, and you're not gonna leave with anything. And so it really I did not feel like I was being set up for success, in a lot of ways. And the other thing that is really interesting that happened that I think is such a, like it's really wild, but we talk a lot about in the, like, intuitive eating and health at every size, healing relationship with food space about how when you are restricted from something, it really creates this desire to have more of it, and this happened during, like, the very beginning of quarantine, at 20 in 2020. I just, like, felt this, like, wild desire to purchase excessive amounts of certain things that I was worried that I wouldn't have, which I know happened with toilet paper, but I'm talking about food, like ice cream and, like, I think that was the thing. I just felt like I needed to have so much of it in my freezer because I was worried what would happen if I didn't have access to it, and I haven't cared about ice cream like that since I was, like, in the middle of dealing with my binging and purging. And it was really interesting because that it's so true that that restrictive, like, scarcity mindset for whatever reason really does affect how our thinking is around what we have access to. And the same thing happened that day when I got that message. I, like, ordered a bagel and, like, a giant juice or something. Like, I was like, "All I want is straight carbohydrate, like, don't give me any protein, don't give" I probably put cream cheese on my bagel, but, like, I don't want anything except for just direct carbohydrate that's gonna spike my blood sugar, and I voiced that to one of my friends at work, and it was like, "Yeah, of course you do," because when you're asked to, like even when I was given the glucose drink to have, it was like, "Make sure you don't eat something high in carbs at dinner and don't eat cake for breakfast," and then it was like then I was suddenly thinking about eating cake at breakfast, which I don't know if I ever have had cake for breakfast, and it's just, like it's important to acknowledge it because obviously I didn't just continue eating fruit juice and bagels after that, like, at all times. But I think it's important to really acknowledge how, like, real that is, um, because I've heard it from so many people and have experienced that myself, and it's if we're providing advice on what someone needs to be eating, we need to be partnering with that person and how to make it work for them because just telling someone what to do, like, that's part of why diets don't work is for that restrictive mentality in addition to the whole piece of, like, we're not supposed to be able to change our biology. Um, but it yeah, it just it sent me in so many directions and really like, I don't feel sorry for myself, it's more of, like, it's frustration at my healthcare provider because if I wasn't me, I just know how damaging this can be because 'cause I've been on the receiving end of the person experiencing this kind of bullshit and, like, how it impacts them, and not because there's anything wrong with people, but I just so happen to be an eating disorder registered dietitian, and so I'm, like, a particular type of person who's not gonna respond well to being told this information. Um, and yeah, I think those are the main reasons that this was super frustrating, and just unhelpful and how, like, it really stressed me out, and I really believe in intuitive eating, like, with my entire being for, like, that everyone can get to a point where they can do that, and I'm not saying, like, don't follow your doctor's advice, like, if there are diet modifications, I think that actually is part of intuitive eating, is that brain knowledge of knowing you may need to do something a little bit differently, so I did make an effort to, like, if I was having, like, a muffin with for breakfast to, like, pair an egg with it or something just to help because when we add proteins and fibers and fats to which the egg would be fat and protein, not fiber, um, it helps to slow the spike of your blood sugar, and so I did make an effort to just be a little bit more aware of not eating carbs by themselves, but I also didn't cut anything out, like, if I wanted something that was high in sugar, I still allowed myself to have it because, 1, I was protecting my mental well-being of not even playing around with being hormonal and having this history of an eating disorder because I'm not going down that path. Um, but I you can be an intuitive eater and, like, incorporate, um, advice for how, like, your body may need something a little bit differently, but that information is, like, hard to come by, and so I just want to, like, put that out there for anyone who has this kind of experience. Um, you probably do need the support of a dietitian or an expert that understands how to incorporate those 2 things, um, which again is super frustrating because it's that is gonna require some access to either having insurance covering this type of specialty or having just money to pay out of pocket to seek this, but luckily there is a lot of free information, like on Instagram and on dietitians' websites, and so there are some links that I'm gonna put, in the show notes of this episode, that kind of reinforce that and offer some basic education. Again, like, it sucks because you can Google these things and you get a little bit, but I think just being reminded that if you're on that path of recovery and intuitive eating that you don't have to just do this 180, um, because I don't think that's appropriate, or helpful for anyone to ever say, like, "Don't eat this." And so, again, like, being very clear, I'm not telling people not to follow their doctor's advice, but I think that it's appropriate to advocate for what you need. In this case, I did not feel like I needed to say anything in that moment because I didn't feel like I needed extra support. It was more of like, do I trust this doctor anymore? Do I need to like never see this person again? And I decided that I'm gonna talk to them after I deliver because I just didn't want anything to, like, put a strain on my relationship with the person I'm trusting to help safely deliver my baby, and I don't feel unsafe with this provider, because of this. I just feel irritated, and I want to share, like, my perspective because I guarantee you I'm not the only person that's gotten a message like that, and just how dangerous that could be. Um, so yeah, that was I really had no idea that that was something I was going to encounter because I specifically, like, said when I met at this practice, there's several different practitioners and you, like, see them all at some point, but I had specifically said, like, I need to vet out basically if you're gonna talk to me about, like, my weight and, like, nutrition in a restrictive way before I feel like I can, like, be here to be supported by this practice because I'm an eating disorder dietitian and I don't believe in that kind of thing. Um, and it wasn't the doctor that, um, read my results and told me this that I had that conversation with, but it just sucks because it would have been nice for that to, like, I don't know, be in my chart and, like, just for it to be if I was told that that was okay, I just would have expected not to receive that. So I will advocate again, more for just, like, one healthcare professional to another. This is not helpful, and here's why, and not I don't think you're a bad doctor, like, anything like that, not an attack. I just want to, like, not be their pregnant patient when I have that conversation is just kind of where I landed.
Fair.
Yeah, so that sucked, and I think that's probably, like, a minor thing to have happened as well, as far as, like, the range of things I've heard, people's doctors tell them, um, and so, yeah, just a ton of compassion because I had no idea the kind of things that would be said to you or that would be, like, encouraged reading, as a pregnant woman, and now I it definitely has broadened my perspective and understanding of just really like, I already thought diet culture was everywhere, but, like, my god, this has been interesting. So the last big piece of this is, talking just about, like, comments that have been made about my body and just, like, the blatant disrespect of boundaries that have happened, since I became pregnant, and part of I think there have certainly been times where I was asked permission to like, when a bump comes out, like, people wanna touch it, and I, like, believe when I say we shouldn't be commenting on other people's bodies. I don't think pregnancy is an exception to that, um, and I've had a lot of conversations with people who have like, said something to me, and I don't know if it's that they, like, saw a look on my face or what caused this conversation to engage, but just me explaining that I think that it's really like, if my body wasn't being commented on before, like, me having a bump is not a reason to start commenting on my body, and, like, I don't want comments on my body, uh, and just, like, how women are regarded as being quote unquote cute when they're pregnant, and then they're expected to just, like, look exactly the way they did before, after delivering the baby, and, like, that's not cute anymore, and that's only talking about someone who exists within privilege because someone in a larger body who's pregnant may not show e everyone shows at different rates, but they may not show in the same way, and so are they not cute? Because they don't have this like, it's so wildly inappropriate to me, and a lot of people shared that, like, the reason they commented was because they find it really, like, incredible that a human body can do that, and I do believe that that's probably the main reason people commented, um, especially, like, when I first began to show, but things like being told I am the cutest pregnant person they've ever seen or that I do pregnancy really well, it just it frustrated me because I purposely do not want attention, regarding my body because that's something I've really tried to move away from, and don't think any of us should be seeking attention for, um, and it just sucked because it suddenly was, like, all people wanted to talk about, and trying to explain this felt almost like I was being harsh, and it just it's very uncomfortable, and so I think my point here is to, again, like, before you comment on people's bodies, um, and I certainly, like, I don't know everyone who listens to this podcast, and there's probably people who listen who have made comments about my body and me being a cute pregnant person, and the point of this isn't to, like, at anyone, but just, like, I don't think pregnancy is an exception to when we should talk about bodies, um, and I am willing to bet there's a lot of people who probably do want comments about it because it's a wild time when your body changes so rapidly, like, in a 9-month period, and you really don't feel like yourself anymore, but I think, like, we should try not to seek external validation, um, around our body size, and that is, like, tried and true for me no matter, like, what's going on. Um, there's a lot of influencers who show, like, their stretch marks in their belly after having, a baby to normalize it, and I just wanna say, like, don't be expecting that from me, um, because I actually think that's really harmful, because the people I'm seeing do it are people with thin privilege, and I never think before and afters are helpful in that way. I used to do that stuff, and I realized and will always apologize for taking part in that, um, of that, like, having loose skin and stretch marks. First of all, you don't have to have been pregnant to have that, and you don't, like, only deserve to find that acceptable because you've birthed and like, carried and birthed a child. And I think we like to make these excuses all the time of like, "Oh, it's okay to not be perfect because you're a mom or because blah, blah, blah." And just, like, it's okay not to be perfect, period. Uh, and if that's what you're striving for, if that's what you need and want, like, that is your prerogative, like, you do you. But for anyone who is really wanting to do that healing work and is doing it and just, like, sometimes it gets really hard and you just want a reminder that, like, it's okay, like, you don't need that excuse ever, and, like, there's only so many times that someone posting their stomach flab when they are bent over and sat down to say that they've, like, aren't like, we don't need we don't need that. I think sometimes it feels helpful, but I just wanna put that perspective out there as well.
Yeah, no,
So,
I
I
totally
think
agree with you on that. Like, I was gonna say, it totally I think a lot of people will hear that and say, "Oh, man, that's one of my favorite things." Like, I think that you know what I'm saying? But,
I used to love that shit.
yeah. No, I think that yeah, a lot of like, I think it's a people see that first and then get excited, but I do, yeah, definitely just beg everybody to think about the prerequisites of those photos and the, like, you know, we're normalizing some of that stuff, but, ultimately not entirely accepting every body type when we do that kinda thing.
Yeah, no, not at all. And basically the, like, moral of this episode is that acceptance of varying body sizes and, like, individual journeys and ethnicities, like, there's very little acceptance. Like, the advice that I've received has truly been catered to thin white women, um, and that's bullshit. Um, and also, it's very easy to get unhelpful advice, that can be extremely triggering and unhelpful and inappropriate and just further, like, stigmatizing, and that is like, that's where we're at right now, and I think that advocation, which really freaking sucks to have to do it, um, like, that's where we're at and what we need to keep doing and what I'm going to continue doing and encouraging people to do, um, because I think that's what it's gonna take, like, we need education, yes, and I think it goes a long way for someone to have a one-on-one conversation with a healthcare provider, um, to, like, share that experience so that they can maybe they'll continue sending those exact same messages, but maybe they've also never most people are not specialists in eating disorder treatment, and so, like, maybe they've never considered that perspective or, like, maybe they don't always think about privilege, when they give advice either because a lot of, nutrition advice is requires a large amount of privilege and access to things that not everyone has, and they still deserve that same level of care, um, and that's another gigantic problem, but, um, yeah, advocate, don't comment on people's bodies, um, and yeah, and certainly, I wanna be very clear that, like, when people had shared that it's really cool to see, like, the miracle of a child growing, that I have found that cool too, and I certainly have shared with friends and family, like, updates of my bump growing, for them to, like, be part of that experience because I think there was a lot of excitement there too, and none of that was coming from a place of, like, asking for, like, uh, validation on not being, not looking away that I shouldn't look or anything like that. So I just wanna, like, say I'm not here to say that there's no like, when I talk about not commenting on bodies, it's more I'm coming from a place more of, like, not making that a focus, of the fact that it's happening, but I understand because it is an outward thing, um, at varying levels for different body sizes, that is something that there is going to be attention paid to, but it was more of the, like, the comments about being someone who does pregnancy well or, like, it that you don't, deserve praise for how your body shows up pregnant, or need to be told that, like, it's okay that you're gaining weight because you're pregnant or things like that, because I think they just really enforce a lot of the, like, fat phobic and diet culture messages, that really don't promote healing overall, and you never know what, um like, someone's state is about their bodies or, like, where they have been or where they currently are, and just that additional commentary probably isn't helpful, but I think acknowledging that, like, it's cool that a baby is growing inside of someone. I don't think that that is inherently wrong. So just want to make sure and be very like clear about that. Um, but yeah, thank you guys for listening. This is the last episode of season 1 of Diet Culture, and I'm first of all very excited to be a first time mom and do that. But I look forward to coming back to this um, project in the spring and continue to bring this conversation. Um, yeah, that's it. Just to continue to bring this conversation.
Awesome. Awesome stuff.
Thank you for listening. Diet Culture is co-produced by myself and my brother, Nick Lewis. You can keep up with what's going on with Diet Culture on my Instagram page at Dietitian Dani Cast. If you prefer to watch rather than just listen, check us out on YouTube, and we always love ratings and reviews if you haven't done so already. Thank you so much for your support, and can't wait to talk to you next week.